Keir Starmer wants the votes of the far right. And people who are going to be offended by this are the same people who've been offended by my other videos about the far right in Britain because they don't like being labelled as the far right. But unfortunately, those people are aligning themselves with the far right and far right policies. And it's the kind of people that Starmer is trying to get in. So we'll talk about it. And the thing is, these people make up at most about 15% of the British electorate. It's the same people who were voting for the BNP, the EDL when they did political stuff, the Brexit Party, UKIP, Reform. It's all the same people, more or less. And, it's the kind of people who love the things that horrible human beings, and I use human beings with air quotes there, like Enoch Powell, said. And Keir Starmer wants to repeat this with his Island of Strangers rubbish. It's the same, like in this Guardian article, and we're going to look at a few articles actually, but this Guardian article is basically comparing it to the racist, inflammatory rhetoric of the people of Enoch Powell and his ilk used to try and stoke up populist violence and populist jingoism, which, honestly, let's be honest, they probably didn't even believe themselves. They just knew they could probably use it to whip up a extremist section of the British public to try and get some support, mostly try and get some monetary aid and monetary gain, which is something that, the Reform Party and its leadership have just been enriched since they came into political prominence. And it's the same thing that people like Keir Starmer want to do. And we'll get more into that in a later section of this video. But if we're looking at here, this section I thought was quite interesting, where it is the kind of people who are criticizing Keir Starmer. So this was his quote: "In a diverse nation like ours, we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together." That doesn't make any sense, because you're saying in a diverse nation, but then you're saying we'll become an island of strangers. But an island of people become strangers when they aren't giving the facilities to be able to not be strangers. And for 15 years, we saw cuts to all sorts of community building things in Britain. We saw cuts to youth centres for children to go out and, meet each other. I remember as a child, I would go to the youth centre, and then the youth centre got all its funding cut by the time I was a teenager, maybe. So prior to the Conservatives, there was plenty of funding, and then basically when austerity came in, the youth centre went. And then we see parks getting worse and worse. We're seeing third spaces that were free being shut down, being replaced with corporate third spaces, with third spaces that have to be monetized for people to go to, and less people go there. And then Starmer adds basically saying, it's because of the brown people. It's because of they're not white people that this is happening, when it's just happening because of austerity. Zara Sultana came out saying, "This speech fueled decades of racism and division. Echoing it today's disgrace, it adds to the anti-migrant rhetoric that puts lives at risk. Shame on you, Keir Starmer." Which is true, because last year, the exact same people who Starmer is trying to appeal to are the type of people who went out and tried to burn down hotels with asylum seekers in them. They were the same people who were punching and attacking. I remember one video vividly, attacking a black man in a park because he was walking. The same people who were, I believe, were trying to attack mosques last year. The same people who desecrated Muslim graves, I believe, earlier this year. And also, I think it happened this time last year. It is the exact same rhetoric. Even the Green Party hopeful says it's not even subtle, the racism. You've seen multiple Labour MPs coming out saying Starmer's chasing the tails of the right, risking our country down, taking our country down a very dark path. This is like the entire thing. Everything Starmer is saying is the kind of stuff that Enoch Powell said in an attempt to whip up hatred, because it's far easier to monetize hatred than it is to actually action change that will be positive. Because actioning change that's positive requires long-term investment. It requires doing something that will last a long time, whereas hatred is a very spur of the moment. It's a very right now feeling, a very right now thing you can harness. And, I don't think Kier Starmer truthfully has any goals of being a politician in 4 years' time. I think he just wants to support right now to show he can be popular, to show he can have power, and instead of doing that over a longer period of time, trying to, if you want to use a football analysis, he doesn't want to be Mikel Arteta. He wants to be someone who can just buy a Galacticos team and try and win like that, instead of actually building something, or hopefully far more competently than Arteta has at the moment. But that's kind of the case, and this rise in migration that we saw, it's completely false, because it's not like all of a sudden loads of people just decided to come to Britain. And again, the majority of people who come to Britain are legal migrants. They are people who come to work, and mostly so people who come to study, because Britain has really great universities, and the universities like it because they can make more money off of the foreign students. And those foreign students, some of them will stay here and work and get graduate jobs or do further education. A lot of them leave. You also have the case of Rishi Sunak signing a deal with India, where basically he was like, we'll flood the market with these highly skilled workers from India who can stay for a couple of years, and those couple of years are probably going to come to an end relatively soon, and then they can leave and go back to India. So again, it was a case of them trying to appeal to the far right in India, because India has a far right government at the moment. So it's the UK political parties trying to appeal to a different form of the far right to try and get them on side, to try and enrich themselves. And thus, it doesn't work. It's caused an influx of some migration, and those people are going to leave and take away those highly skilled roles, because you didn't invest in a stopgap. In the meantime, this comes to something that Ray Newton-Smith said, the Confederacy of British Industry Chief Executive said, the reality of business is that it's more expensive and more difficult to fill a vacancy with migration than if you could hire locally or train workers. When considering along the large fees and accompanying charges, foreign workers are simply not easy or cheap alternative. So it's not like people are trying to just force people to come here, even though Starmer's saying they encourage businesses to bring low-paid workers rather than invest in people. Well, they're not, because the Sunak example, which is surprisingly a decent thing Sunak did, or at least in a certain view, most of the people here are coming who are highly skilled. They're people who are educated or are going to get educated, and they will pump money into Britain whilst they are here. And I believe I looked at a stat, and I'll try and put it on the screen if I can find it, but a higher percentage of the people who come to the UK as migrants, who aren't students, have a higher percentage rate of being university educated compared to the general UK population. And, it's kind of a thing where, because the UK spent so many years demonizing further education, demonizing people for going out to, be more educated, demonizing people for taking certain apprenticeships and certain roles, and then when there were apprenticeships, not funding them properly, you don't have the people to fill the higher end roles, and then people come in. And then Starmer wrongfully saying it is low-paid workers. That's not the case in reality. There are some sectors that there will be low-paid workers, but that's because they're not paid well regardless in the UK. If you look at carers, and even anecdotally I can talk about this, carers who are British born, British educated, have British qualifications, are paid peanuts already. And this was before we saw any sort of influx of carers coming in from abroad. The carers coming in from abroad probably need to be paid more than the people who are British born. So obviously it's not they're driving down the wages. Under the wage laws we've seen with the Tories and also Labour, it's actually relatively high compared to, what is actually done, what they're actually claiming is done, which is bring down the wages. It's just simply not the case. And let's move on to another of the articles. Let's move on to this the National one from Scotland. And the National is a more left-wing one, but this was them basically talking to experts, people who probably know a lot more than you, me, and even Kier Starmer himself. And there was one quote in particular here that I thought was quite interesting, which was here. I think it was from Alyssa Noti, who is a senior lecturer at University of York and a co-author of the letter that they're basically talking about in this article. It is not the first time a traditional political party has tried to copycat, mimic the immigration policy and rhetoric of far-right parties. I guess in order to gain lost electoral support. But that electoral support isn't even that big. I think if it's here, she says something quite interesting, which is, Nuti adds that, we'll actually go here. We've seen it lots of times where we're really concerned about it, and this is though we thought there was time to say something about it. Okay, that's actually not what I wanted to read. Basically, we have seen this kind of strategy. First of all, we think it's dangerous, morally speaking, and is contributing to a climate of hostility towards the most vulnerable among us. Again, the kind of people who are sending me death threats are the same people who are out trying to burn down hotels because they had a couple of asylum seekers in them. But I think it's the biggest thing. It gives more political salience to the issue, to their framing of the current situation, giving them validity, them being the likes of Reform, instead of offering a different interpretation of what's going on, a different version of society that can mobilize people. I think this guy gives also a good point as well here. He kind of builds on that point. He says, the consensus amongst political scientists and academics who study this has been, from the get-go, from way back, that it won't work. The reason why they tend to think that is you're validating them. You're saying, yes, Nigel Farage is right. That's the main problem, is too many immigrants coming into the country. Don't vote for him, vote for us. But like they're saying, that doesn't make sense, because if you're going to appeal to the far right, and I said the same thing about the Democrats at the US election, if you're going to appeal to these people and say, yeah, my opponent is correct, thus I'm going to say the same thing as them, why don't you vote for me? But if you're saying your opponent is correct and you're trying to appeal to the people who are voting for that opponent, well, they're just going to be like, well, yeah, you said they're right. I'm just going to vote for them because you're the one who said they were right. It's the same thing the Democrats did, where they were like, hey, Donald Trump is right about everything. We're going to do the same stuff as Donald Trump. And there's some Trump voters are like, oh, well, I guess I'm just going to vote for Donald Trump then, because you're going to do the same stuff as him. That's what Starmer's doing. He's legitimizing Farage, even though Farage's actual points aren't legitimate. Everything he's saying, and I remember watching Question Time where someone asked about illegal migration and irregular migration, and even the BBC were incorrectly interpreting it. They were actually repeating what Reform say. They were conflating illegal migration and irregular migration as the same thing, which is what Reform have done, and why, like I saw in that the previous video I made where a lot of people were commenting, a lot of people simply have been deliberately misinformed between the two. Seeking asylum isn't illegal migration. Seeking asylum is you do irregular migration and then you seek asylum, which is completely legal. And then instead You have people like Nigel Farage, the rest of Reform. You're now seeing the Tories doing it. You're seeing parts of Labour do it, where they're saying that's illegal migration and that needs to stop. When illegal migration is mostly people, and it's not mostly, it literally is people overstaying their visas or not having the correct visas. And a smaller percentage is people who just have no visas. But the people who are coming over as asylum seekers are seeking asylum. According to Home Office figures, it was 80% of the people who came were also legitimate asylum seekers as well. So clearly the numbers don't align with that. But because they're all looking for a scapegoat, because having a scapegoat is far easier, like I said, than addressing the actual issues that are plaguing our country, which is chronic underfunding, which is price gouging from corporations. It's corporations underpaying people regardless of where they're from and regardless of the industry you work in. You are underpaid, and you are thankfully not as overworked as places like the US and parts of Asia, but they certainly want to push for that. There's this battle against working from home, which has had such a positive mental impact on workers. There's this opposition to a 4-day work week, which again we saw had such a positive impact on workers as well, because it doesn't help these companies line their pockets, and it doesn't help the politicians who have investments in these companies line their pockets too. Now, if we look at Middle East Eye's version of this, they kind of repeat some of the stuff the other two have said, but like here, they're saying there's serious alarm about this because, look, Starmer said we have to make the case for the benefits of migration, adding that Britain doesn't scapegoat migrants and that failing in public services are not the fault of migrants or people who came here. That's what Starmer said 5 years ago when he was going for the leadership of Labour, and now he's saying the exact opposite, because this truth here is harder to actually implement. It's not hard to say, but it's harder to actually implement change because it takes a long time. Change won't happen overnight because we've had 15 years of austerity to have to undo. We've had chronic underfunding of everything, so this change takes a long time. But this scapegoating takes one speech. He gave one speech about it, and now you've got just Reform voters repeating this disgusting line, which isn't here. Island of Strangers. Here it is. Island of Strangers line. And it's this dangerous pattern, and I think I made another video about this, and there's a good portion here about it, where Kier Starmer doesn't actually believe in anything other than what's going to get him power and probably get him money. And I think this part here is quite interesting. Holden explains that Starmer, having no beliefs of his own, defines himself on terms set for him by his political opponents, which is precisely the case. Throughout his time in the Labour leadership, he's seen what his opponents are doing, and he's like, yeah, but I'm going to do the same thing but better. With Rishi Sunak being like, I'm going to fix the economy by basically doing more austerity. Starmer became Prime Minister and was like, I'm going to fix the economy by doing more austerity but better. You have Nigel Farage talking about how he wants to stop the immigrants, and Keir Starmer's like, oh yeah, I'm just going to stop the immigrants, but I'm going to do it better. And look, here it is. Starmer's Labour has joined Kemi Badenoch's Tories and Farage's Reform in a battle for a small group of racist voters, because the people who really, really love this rhetoric do not make up a majority of the British electorate. But it is so much easier to put a spotlight on this instead of saying, you know what, we have systemic issues in the UK. We have chronic underfunding, which is caused by austerity, which has led to more privatization. These private companies clearly don't have the interests of the people firsthand. We look at the water companies, where because of privatization, the water companies are being very lax in their protection of our water. And even though we fine them, the fines are never enough to make up for the difference in income they make, by putting up your bill and by cutting costs and cutting corners. And that's why you have sewage in your drinking water. I'm really sorry. Instead of trying to tackle with that, they were like, this is a much easier and small section of the population to pick up. I believe the Greens often quote the fact that more people actually care about climate change. More people are happy for there to be higher taxes if it meant dealing with climate change. It was a bigger thing for the population than anything to do with any of this rubbish that the far right and Keir Starmer are trying to talk about. And frankly, it's gotten so bad that people who support these kind of ideas are actually kind of turning on Starmer. This is The Spectator. It is edited by Michael Gove, but I'm trying to be better at including those kind of people stuff in this. But there's a few points in this that are raised that are like quite like pointed. So Starmer, I think this was written yesterday. It was written today, actually. And Starmer's in Albania at the moment, and he's basically trying to convince Albania to be like, you know that Rwanda plan the Tories want to do? Can we do that in Albania? And Albania are like, no, go away. It doesn't make any sense for us to do that. We don't support these kind of ideas. And then he's like, well, you guys did it with Italy, and then Albania are like, I've been very clear since day one when we started this process with Italy that this is a one-off because of very close relationship and geographical situation, which makes a lot of sense. They are next to each other. We have been asked by several countries if we are open to it, and we have said no because we are loyal to the marriage with Italy and the rest is just love. Basically, Italy's putting some of their asylum seekers in Albania, in these like Albanian detention centers, which isn't even a good return hubs, as they're calling them, paid for and run by Britain to house and deport failed asylum seekers. But the asylum seekers you can just deport. The failed asylum seekers you can just deport. You know, again, this is something that is not really an actual issue. And again, this is a Spectator talking about it, but this isn't an issue because failed asylum seekers are deported by the UK. This isn't actually an issue, but obviously it's the Spectator and they're trying to make an issue out of it. And there is one other point that he brings up in this Nicholas Farrell, which is here. But Britain's real migrant problem is not illegal migrants arriving from the Channel and the stupid shit about France. Is the hundreds of thousands of migrants who arrive illegally in Britain each year, which, again, isn't a massive issue, but obviously it is the Spectator and it's Michael Gove and they're doubling down on because they're Tories as well. But again, illegal immigrants, and again, even here, they're conflating irregular migration with illegal immigrants because that's kind of the right wing's talking point, isn't actually the issue. And even the Spectators talking about that, it's not a real issue. It's not a real problem that we have. It's just being framed as such because it's so much easier to talk about that. Migration to the UK isn't an actual issue if you put in the effort to solving the actual problems in the UK. The lack of housing is caused by a lack of funding when it comes to actually building housing into training apprentices. The lack of housing is caused because the Tories decided to sell off a bunch of council housing, and then New Labour decided to continue doing that as well. And so the council housing, which was meant to still be there, got sold off and it wasn't replaced. Because that was neoliberal politics. It was better to just they didn't want the state to be the ones building this affordable and actually very good housing for people. They wanted to allow private corporations to do it, and the corporations didn't do it because they didn't think they can maximize their income from it. We have a shortage of highly skilled workers because the UK government refuses to spend the money to invest in that. And thus, we do have people coming in, people who are already better skilled and better educated than people born in Britain, and they will fill some of the gap. We don't have the investment in training people to be carers, because jobs like carers are, for decades, have been demonized and looked down upon by the British and by British culture. So no one wants to train in actually being a carer. And also, the care system is underfunded because of austerity. So then the people who work in care at the moment, regardless of where they're from, are paid very low wages, which then is a cycle that people don't want to go into care, because they're not going to be paid very well unless maybe you end up running your own care home, which is a whole financial burden in itself to be able to do. And even with that, your purpose shouldn't be, I want to make money off of care. It's, I actually want to provide good care for this aging population, which is going to get older and older, and we're going to have fewer and fewer workers because we're having more older people, and who are just getting worse health-wise because they're working longer and their health is deteriorating. And even though their health is deteriorating, they're still living longer, which leads to more health deterioration. So and then things like community, island of stranger. Well, you've cut all the places where you can build community. The only places you can build community are your job and paid for places you have to go to. And with the cost of living crisis, because of corporate greed, people can't afford to do it. You can't afford to go out with your friends and pay to do something. And when people were doing free things like going out and going to the park as a youngster, youngsters are being told you can't go out and do that. You can't go to shopping centres. You're not allowed to do that. It's all because we've had so much right-wing and neoliberal politics. The problems are going to take a long time to unravel. But Labour don't want to do that. Labour are like, we just want very short-term gains. And because we've had so much right-wing politics, we have so many right-wing parties, why don't we just copy them and do the same and put our own little spin on it? And hopefully people won't like the Tories enough that they're just going to vote for us by default. It is terrible politics, it is backwards politics, and it is politics which leads to saying racist and dangerous things like this, because this is going to become a slogan for the far right. It's going to become a speech that the far right will use to justify their violence. I am not going to put it past the people who sent me death threats in previous videos to be the exact same people going out on the streets trying to burn down migrant hotels again this year, trying to burn down asylum seeker hotels again this year, trying to desecrate the graves of non-white people again this year, because people like Keir Starmer are encouraging this behavior by using this rhetoric.